It has been a couple weeks since we've studied in Matthew's Gospel. We had Thanksgiving a couple weeks ago, and then we had the business meeting last week. And so in our last study, in verses 1 through 13 of chapter 17, we saw the transfiguration of Christ. Jesus took Peter, James, and his brother John up on, Matthew says, a high mountain. We don't know what mountain that was, but really there is only one high mountain in the whole area. It's Mount Hermon, that's in the northern part of Israel. And there, as Peter, James, and John watched, Jesus was transfigured. He was revealed in his glory. Now, the why of the transfiguration isn't given to us. We're not told why Jesus was revealed in his glory to these three disciples, but that he took three of the disciples with him, no doubt was crucial to their training. Remember now that Jesus is heading into the last phase of his ministry. He would soon be going to Jerusalem, where he's going to be betrayed and crucified. And the disciples needed this moment of revelation of who Jesus really was to steel them for what was coming. Since both Moses and Elijah appeared and spoke with Jesus there on the mount as he was revealed in his glory, this may have been for Christ himself a time to kind of resurface into the atmosphere of heaven, draw a big breath of glory as then he descended, into earth to finish his mission. And so really, you kind of look at it maybe as like, rising to the surface of heaven, getting a big gulp of glory, and then coming back down to complete his mission. So the glory dims, Moses and Elijah split, and Jesus is back to the humble servant along with the three as they walk down the mountain and straight into a challenge. Verse 14, Matthew 17, and when they had come to the multitude, which was, of course, waiting patiently at the foot of the hill, a man came to him, that is Jesus, kneeling down to him and saying, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is an epileptic and suffers severely, for he often falls into the fire and often into the water. And so I brought him to your disciples, but they could not cure him. Now, Mark adds some important details to this story in his gospel. As the four, Jesus, Peter, James, and John, returned from the mountain, they found a debate going on between the disciples and some scribes who had brought this father and son to them. The son was severely afflicted by a demon that had nearly succeeded in killing him several times. And try as they might, the disciples weren't able to help this young boy. So the scribes used this to attack the disciples and to put doubt on their rabbi, Jesus. You see, word had gotten out about their prior ministry trip that Matthew records for us in chapter 10, when Jesus had sent out the disciples to preach, to heal, and to cast out demons. And they had had power over demons. But these scribes had only heard reports of that. They'd not seen it with their own eyes. And as skeptics, they simply refused to believe. And so they came now to prove that the disciples couldn't cast out demons by dragging along what they knew would be a really hard case. And sure enough, the disciples weren't able to help this poor guy. Now, what's disturbing in the story so far is the hardness of the scribes' hearts, that they would be willing to add to the torment of this man and his son by using them as tools to attack Jesus. We see the contrast here between the purely religious who have no compassion and God who is full of compassion. What made this case of demon possession in the mind of the skeptics impossible to help is that, as Mark tells us, that this boy was both mute and deaf. He couldn't speak, he couldn't hear. And as we've already seen, a mute demon-possessed person was considered by the Jews to be an impossible case to help. Because in Jewish exorcisms, the key was to get the demon to admit its name. Once you had its name, then you had power over it, you could take authority over it, and you could cast it out. So Jewish exorcisms were these long, drawn-out, laborious, exhausting affairs where an exorcist would take forever, days of literally trying to cajole and manipulate and trick the spirit into giving up its name. And then, of course, once the name was given, then the exorcist could take authority over it, call its name, and if you, in effect, if you will, kind of pull it out of the person, okay? Well, Jesus had shown already that this wasn't his style of exorcism whatsoever. It wasn't laborious or exhausting for him. Somebody was demon-possessed would come, Jesus would just say, come out. The thing would go. And people were stunned, they said, Matthew records, by the authority with which he commanded these demons. And he'd already healed some mute, demon-possessed people. Because remember, the trick is get the demon to say its name. So can you understand why a mute demon-possessed person would be considered an impossible case to solve? So this young boy, his problem, he's mute and deaf. He can't even hear. And so now they're thinking, okay, this is an impossible case. He won't be able to deal with this guy at all. So these scribes weren't there when the others had been delivered. They simply refused to believe that Jesus had the power to do this. They were convinced that he was a fraud, and in their minds, they're going to prove it. When they arrived, Jesus wasn't there because, well, where was he? He's up on the mount with the 3 disciples. So they went to the disciples waiting for him to return. They issued their challenge. They weren't able to help. That then sparked an angry debate between the disciples and the scribes while the crowd is looking on. Jesus returns while the debate is in full swing. He asks the scribes what the brouhaha is over, and that's when the Father steps forward to explain. He told Jesus about what had happened, verse 17. Then Jesus answered and said, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him here to me. Now, in light of the boy's pathetic condition and the father's desperation, you got to admit this response does seem kind of harsh, doesn't it? I mean, where's the compassion that has marked Jesus so far? Is he getting tired? Is he getting frustrated? Hold on. Where has he just been? Up on the mount being transfigured, for goodness sake. He's refreshed. He's renewed. So, folks, please understand, this is not a case of him being tired. He's not frustrated here. No, friends, these words are aimed not at the Father and not at the disciples. Who were these words aimed at? The scribes. They're pointed at the same people that Jesus had in chapter 16 called a wicked and adulterous generation, because they demanded that Jesus perform a sign for them, the scribes. Jesus is ticked that they have used this poor family to trap him. He's appalled at their settled unbelief. In verse 15, Matthew says the boy was an epileptic. The word is literally, you ready for this? Lunatic. Literally meaning moonstruck. Lunatic. The idea was this: epilepsy was thought to be caused by the phases of the moon. The ancient world attached power to the heavenly bodies, which is the origin of astrology. Different phases of the sun, moon, and stars were thought to exert different influences on people. And from the description of this boy's symptoms, we would say that he had severe seizures. He fell down, foamed at the mouth, cried out, shook, and went rigid. What was unusual about his seizures is that they regularly occurred when he was near something dangerous, like the Father says. Where? Fire and water. This was more than mere epilepsy. It was a severe form of demon possession, which began when this boy was quite young. Mark says when the boy was brought to Jesus, the demon reacted and a horrible fit began. And he was thrown violently to the ground, began thrashing about, foamed at the mouth. And Jesus asked, how long has this been going on? The Father told Jesus that it had been going on since he was just a lad, and it was obvious that the demon wanted to kill the boy. And then Mark records that the Father said this. Here's what Mark says. The Father says, if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. Isn't that just a cry of desperation? I mean, just imagine a father saying that. Well, his son's writhing on the ground. Oh, if you can do anything, help us. Now, what's interesting is that the way that Mark tells this story, it seems that the Father had begun as a half-hearted accomplice of the scribes. But at this display of his son's torment, his desperation returns, and he pleads with Jesus to help. Before Jesus did, he repeated the plea for help back to the Father, because this was something everyone there needed to learn. Jesus said to him, Mark tells us, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. See, the Father said, if you can do anything, do it. Jesus said, in effect, if you can believe, you can have anything. This Father needed to set aside the distractions of the scribe's plot and the loud debate between his opponents and supporters, and just see Jesus standing there with compassion in his eyes. And it was then that he realized that Jesus was the answer to all of it. And so in Mark 9:24, we read this, the Father says, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. One of the evidences of genuine faith, listen to this. One of the evidences of genuine faith is the realization of how small it is in light of the grandeur and the glory of God. Lord, I believe, but I should believe more. Couldn't we all say a hearty amen to that? I mean, and as much as we believe, don't we say, man, what I should believe is even far greater than I can even imagine. Lord, I know that you are worthy of so much more faith than I've invested in you. Lord, I believe. Would you please help my unbelief? Well, verse 18 here in Matthew 17, and Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the child was cured from that very hour, and all the scribes fell on their faces and worshiped for Jesus. Not in the text, right? Should be though, right? Should be, but it's not. These guys just go from here just grumbling. Well, that didn't work out. And they come back later with another thing. And eventually they're going to be crying out, crucify him, crucify him. Because unbelief is not an issue of reason. If you've determined to reject Christ, it doesn't matter how much evidence is set before you. Now, Mark says the demon fled, but before it did, it gave the boy a last thrashing. This was a sign that it was an especially hateful and powerful demon. It resisted Christ to the very end. It didn't cower or plead as some of the other demons did. It was vicious, and it left reluctantly. So violent was its departure that they assumed the boy was dead afterwards, and Jesus had to take him by the hand and lift him up. Verse 19, then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, why could we not cast it out? So Jesus said to them, because of your unbelief. For assuredly, I say to you, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. So when it was all over, the crowd's gone away, and this is at a later time, the disciples come to Jesus. And they say, what's going on? Why could we not help this young boy when you just came and just did it like that? What's going on? And Jesus laid the problem at the weakness of their faith because of their unbelief. He used an interesting word here, though, for unbelief. Literally, and you might want to write this in the margin, the word is literally should be translated as weak faith. They failed because their faith was weak and ineffectual. And then Jesus drew a contrast. While their faith was weak, even the tiniest amount of the right kind of faith accomplishes the impossible. Both mustard seeds and mountains were idioms to first century Jews. A mustard seed spoke of something exceedingly tiny. A mountain was a symbol for something solid and immovable. The lesson was this. It's not how much faith you have, but what your faith is in. That's what Jesus is saying here. I can believe that I can fly. And I can really get worked up to it. I can start imagining and fantasizing about flying and anybody here have flying dreams? Who has flying dreams? Come on now, let me see the hands. Come on, let me see the hands. Okay, now put both hands up and go like this. Okay, yeah. I have these flying dreams. I do. And they're very vivid for me. And there was a season of my life when every night I would have these flying dreams. I won't go into that now, although it would be kind of fun. So let's say, I have these dreams and they're very vivid, and I start thinking maybe these dreams they're like a sign, and I'm supposed to invest in them, and maybe I really can fly, and maybe I have a superpower, maybe I'm a hero, and I should wear a cape and go up on the roof. And I could get myself all worked up and go up on the roof, and climb up on the edge and jump off and expect to fly. I could have all kinds of faith in that. And you know what's going to happen? Gravity is going to prove that I was believing the wrong thing. And I'm going to have a very quick, intimate appointment with the ground, right? But listen, I could really believe it. Would you all agree with me? There's a lot of delusional people that have some pretty crazy beliefs. I mean, they really believe them. They live in that world that their mind is made up. You can have a tremendous amount of faith in the wrong thing. But then I could have tiny little bit, barely a little bit of faith, just enough faith at LAX to walk down that jetway and get on that plane and get in that very uncomfortable little seat and buckle in. And you know what? Wherever that plane is supposed to go is where it's going to get because of the laws of aerodynamics. It doesn't matter how much faith I have, as long as it's in the right thing, just enough, barely enough to get on the plane. I've been with some people that have that kind of faith. They're like, no. And they get where they're supposed to go. Because their faith, their little bit of faith, is in something worthy of that faith. It isn't how much faith you have, it's what you're believing in that matters. If you have faith just the size of a mustard seed, if you know that it's God's will to move that mountain, you can speak to that mountain, be moved, and it'll move. Well, neither Matthew nor Mark tell us exactly why the disciples' faith had weakened so they couldn't help this boy. What Jesus said to them suggests the cause. Because, listen, in chapter 10, he sent them out to preach and to heal and to cast out demons, and they did. They came back stoked about what God had used them to do. Why weren't they able to help this young man? Well, because their faith had grown stale. Following Jesus and seeing the miraculous had become routine. There had been a subtle shift in their hearts from the intimacy of a personal relationship with Jesus to being a disciple as a job. I want you to stop and think about, go back a couple years when Jesus first invited them to follow him. Can you understand how excited they would be about being close to him and being so attentive to him and paying such close attention to him? Because the goal of a disciple is to be. So you're paying such close attention to him. I mean, you're watching everything. You're eating up this relationship that you're privileged to have with him. But can you understand how after a couple years, it's easy to slip into the mindset of being a professional disciple? Hey, everything Jesus says, We've heard him teach the same thing again and again and again. I mean, we've seen him heal a bunch of blind people. We've seen him cast out a lot of demons. We've seen him perform a lot of miracles. Yeah, he does. Yeah, does your master perform miracles? Yeah, he does. Lots of them. Imagine being in that place where the privilege of your call becomes like, yes, I'm a disciple. See my name tag? Being a disciple had become an occupation, something they did rather than something they were. Their relationship with Jesus shifted from being to doing. And because of that, something vital was lost. Their connection to spiritual authority became severed. And that's why they weren't able to cast out this demon. Let me illustrate the difference. I'm a husband and I have a wife. My wife is sitting right there. She's that babe sitting right there. I can do the things a husband does, and I can do them really, really well. I can provide and protect and fix stuff and listen and care and serve and lead. And I can do all of that, and I can do it all really, really well, but without ever really giving myself to my wife or opening up to her so that she can give herself to me. The truth is, that happens in a lot of marriages. After several years, a husband and a wife settle into a comfortable routine of being married, and they stop sharing their hearts and their lives. They share a bed, but they don't share their hearts anymore. A subtle distance creeps in, and before they know it, the love, the attraction, and the sense of oneness is all but gone. Lynn doesn't just want me to do husband stuff. She wants me. Really, what my wife wants is my heart. Men, please hear me. What your wife wants is your heart. She wants your heart. She wants more than your hands and your feet and your brain and your eyes and all the rest of you that does stuff. What she really wants, no, even more, what she really needs as a wife is your heart. She needs to know that you want her, not just that you do stuff for her. Ladies, can I get an amen? And ladies, now hear me, because your husband wants the same thing. But the way you give your heart to him is different than the way that he gives his heart to you. But it's the same thing. What we want is not just performance. I mean, how many times do we say this in different terms? How many times have we heard this? If I have to tell you, it doesn't count. Right? Right? Well, honey, if you would just tell me, then I would know. Well, if I have to tell you, then it wouldn't count. You should know. You understand what that's about? It's about you should know my heart. You should see my heart. And I know that when you do that, what you're doing is you're so attentive to me. It's more than just doing stuff for me. You're giving me yourself, and you're giving me yourself by these actions. The disciples apparently had slipped into this place of routine with Jesus so that even the miraculous had become routine. And they were now seeing themselves not as those who were in vital, intimate relationship with Jesus personally, but it was now, I'm a disciple. And we cast demons out of people. Bring the demons. And when they came, because they were no longer operating out of their relationship with Christ, rather out of their identity as disciples, they didn't have the power. Christian, please hear me. We call ourselves Christians, and that's a label that was made up by man. What God wants is a bride. He wants people that are in intimate relationship with Him. Not people doing a job, but people living the life that He's given to them. That's why he says in verse 21, however, this kind, that is of demon, does not go out except by prayer and fasting. In Ephesians 6, the Apostle Paul says that we are engaged in a spiritual contest with demonic forces that are highly organized around varying levels of power. Overcoming more powerful demons requires more spiritual depth and insight and discipline, things that can only be developed through prayer and fasting. The disciples were perplexed on why they had no power to deliver this young boy, because in chapter 10, as I said, Jesus had sent them out and empowered them to heal and cast out demons. They came back with incredible reports of the miracles that they worked and the exorcisms that they effected. So what went wrong here? Well, they were depending on the previous empowering, as though a perpetual mantle of power had been placed on them, and it wasn't. Their spiritual authority was only as effective as their present union with Christ and their dependence on God. James 4, 7, and 8 says this, therefore, submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Friends, it's when we renew our dependence on God that the devil flees. The essence of prayer is a renewal of our dependence on God. You know what you're saying every time you pray? God, I need your help. That's what you're saying. God, I need your help. Or this other person I'm praying for needs your help. And they need your help because I can't help them. You understand what prayer is? It's a renewal of our dependence on God. The greater our sense of dependence, the greater our spiritual authority. Now the question is, what role does fasting play? Why does Jesus connect abstaining from food as necessary to finding victory over demonic strongholds? Fasting sharpens our focus on who and what we are as spiritual beings as opposed to just simply being physical and fleshly. Let me use another illustration. To gain physical strength, what do you have to do? It requires the proper diet and exercise, right? You have to get the right input by what you eat and the right output in physical exercise. Both require discipline, making changes from what's merely pleasurable to that which will, at first anyway, be difficult. But by consistency in the discipline, you see the change that you want. You gain the strength that you long for. What's true physically is true spiritually. If we would grow spiritually strong, it's not going to happen by taking the easy route. We must invest in the spiritual disciplines of prayer and fasting. One day, Tom announced to his family that he was going to fast and pray for several days, and that's when his 5-year-old daughter, Ginny, who had just learned about fasting and that it meant not eating, she shouted to her dad, "No, Dad, you can't fast. You'll die." Tom explained that there were many men and women who fasted in Bible times, and she said, "Yeah, and they're all dead." A lot of people have that attitude. I can't fast. I'll die. It'll be too hard. Fasting is a spiritual exercise. It's the exercise of your spirit over the natural desire of your flesh to eat. If you want your bicep to get stronger, you do curls. That's this. You do curls. And not with a fork. Right? See? It's with a weight. Listen, the only way that you're going to get stronger bicep is if when you are working out, the muscle says, okay, that's enough. You have to say, no, 3 more. Really. Because it's pushing your muscle past the point of its comfort that signals the muscle you need to grow to get stronger. Okay? Actually, what you do is it's called you work out till failure, till you can't even lift another one. And that signals your body, okay, apparently we're going to need to do more work, so we need to strengthen this. We need to build it up so that next time we need to do this, we'll have enough strength to be able to do more. So you say no to the muscle and you say do 3 more. Hey, listen, when you want your spirit to get stronger, when your belly says feed me, you say no, 3 more hours or 3 more days or however it is that you're fasting. Fasting gives us an opportunity to see how much of an influence our bodies place on us and how strong its demands really are. You want to know how strong your flesh is? Try fasting. You may not think that you have much of a problem with your flesh. Try fasting for 3 days and get back to me. By saying no for a time to the belly and the mouth, it strengthens the spirit. We begin to look at things from a more spiritual than a physical perspective. Our spiritual senses are sharpened. And it becomes easier to resist the sins of the flesh because we're learning how to say no to it. Now, unfortunately, some people think that fasting is a way to score major points with God. So let me just say just right now, fasting is not a way to impress God. I mean, just think about how ludicrous the whole idea of impressing God is to begin with. I mean, He created the universe, all right? He knows what's at the end of black holes. I don't think He's going to be impressed that you gave up a Big Mac. It's just not in the cards, all right? Fasting isn't something we do to get God to do something. It's not a spiritual hunger strike. Fasting's goal is to make us more spiritually minded. Galatians 5:17 says that the flesh and the spirit are at odds with each other. In Matthew 26:41, Jesus said, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Our spirit, who's indwelt by the Holy Spirit, wants to do good, but the flesh that we're far more used to choosing in, by, and for wants what it wants. Fasting is simply a way to see the spirit rise over the flesh. In verse 21, when Jesus said that kind of demon is only dealt with by prayer and fasting, He meant a life cultivated by prayer and fasting. As we walk with Christ, there are going to be times of intense spiritual challenge, and they're rarely announced. They come as an unwelcome surprise. You know, a surprise attack is a key component of warfare. Satan uses it no less on humans, on us. The key to a successful surprise attack is a period of peace before it. You know, you get your enemy to think that you're not going to attack, and then when your enemy relaxes his guard, then whammo. That's why Paul in Ephesians 6 says that we must keep our combat boots on and our helmets on. For many people, when they come home from work and they walk in the front door of their house, what's the first thing that comes off? Shoes, right? Okay, now picture somebody that has a helmet on too, not a hard hat. We're talking a helmet, like a football helmet. Have you noticed during football games, what do players do at halftime? A helmet comes off. It's no fun wearing that thing. But you know, when you're in the game and you're on the line, you better have that helmet on. And if you're in battle, you better have your combat boots on. And that's why Paul says we must always keep these things on, because you never know when the enemy is going to attack you. By the way, is home a place of peace and safety? Are you guaranteed there won't be any spiritual warfare at home? You may take your work shoes off, but you better keep your combat boots on and your helmet on. Prayer and fasting are the main tools of keeping our discernment sharp so we won't get sucker punched by a demon. Verse 22, now while they were staying in Galilee, Jesus said to them, the Son of Man is about to be betrayed into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and the third day he will rise up. And they were exceedingly sorrowful. Now hold on. Sorrowful why? Because he's going to rise from the dead? Look at it again. Jesus says the Son of Man is about to be betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him. And the third day, he will be raised up. And they were exceedingly sorrowful. Wait a minute. Why are you sorrowful? He just said he was going to rise from the dead. All they heard was the hard stuff, that he'd be betrayed and executed. There could be no resurrection without a death. But they didn't grasp what he was saying. They took his words about dying literally, but they spiritualized what he said about rising. Death was something that they were familiar with. Resurrection, not so much. Yet Jesus said that he would rise. And since all of this was said in the same breath, they ought to have taken all of it, what? Literally. And not said, oh, the first part we understand, death, we get that. Okay, he's going to die. This resurrection stuff, I wonder what he means there. It's all in one breath, folks. They should have said, wow, you're going to rise from the dead? That's awesome. But no, they were sorrowful. And here's what this points up for us. All too often, we take the things in the Bible that we understand literally and the things we find a little bit more difficult, we allegorize and spiritualize and make symbolic. We ought not do that. We ought to take all of the word literally, including the stuff that's hard to understand and the hard stuff that we're not familiar with. A classic example is prophecy. People take the book of Revelation and they say, oh, this stuff, John, these visions that John had of the end times, well, that's really hard to understand. So it must all be spiritual. It doesn't have any, it's allegorical. It all, and it means this and it means that. It happened in history and hold on. If all of that John wrote about in Revelation was about the past, then why was it even bothered to be recorded? Because what relevance does it have for us? No, John is clear. These things are to take place in the end times, and what the visions that he had refer to literal things. We should read them as literally as the text itself allows us to read them. Now, clearly they are visions, but they're not visions of nothing. They're visions of something. Ezekiel foretold that the nation of Israel would be gathered back into its land in the end times. And for years and years and years, people assumed, well, that must be spiritual. That must be a reference to the church. And lo and behold, in 1948, Israel was reborn in its land. And yet, even though that happened as a literal fulfillment, and we are seeing a literal fulfillment of Ezekiel 36 and 37 being fulfilled in our own time right now, In the nation state of Israel, people today still say, no, those things were merely symbolic. They were allegorical. They were spiritual. No, we should take these things literally. Jesus said that he would rise from the dead, and he did. Even though they heard it and went, oh, you're going to die? Oh. Yeah, guys, did you not hear I said after that I was going to rise from the dead? Apparently they didn't. Verse 24. When they had come to Capernaum, those who received the temple tax came to Peter and said, does your teacher not pay the temple tax? He said, yes. And when he had come into the house, Jesus anticipated him, saying, what do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take customs or taxes? From their sons or from strangers? Peter said to him, from strangers. Jesus said to him, then the sons are free. Nevertheless, lest we offend them, go to the sea, cast in a hook, take the fish that comes up first, and when you have opened its mouth, you will find a piece of money. Take that and give it to them for me and you. What? Come on, let's be honest. There's some stories we read in the Bible and we go, what? And it seems so out there, so far-fetched that we have a tendency to kind of say, I don't know. Well, let's drill down. Let's see what's going on here. In Exodus chapter 30, verse 13, we find the call for an annual tax to support the temple and its service. In Jesus' day, the temple tax was equivalent to 2 days' wages, and it was collected at the end of March. The Jewish leaders thought to use the temple tax as a way to trap Jesus. They assumed he wouldn't pay the tax because on a previous visit to the temple, he'd shown his displeasure for the way the priests abused the temple grounds by having turned it into a marketplace. Remember this? He was furious, made a whip, overturned the money changers' tables. You remember what he said? Do not make my father's house a den of thieves. And so they assume, we know all about Jesus' attitude towards the temple. He's not going to pay his tax because he's not going to want to support what he considers a corrupt system. Just like some people today say they don't want to pay their taxes because they don't want to fund this or that. Okay? So they think, okay, well, Jesus isn't going to pay. They think they can trap Jesus, have him arrested. So they ask Peter, does your master pay the tax? Now, Peter knows that they're trying to trap him. He says, well, of course he does. And then he goes home. Do we? Jesus knows what Peter's going to say. And so Jesus answers Peter's concern by telling a little parable. In the ancient world, listen, one of the benefits of being close to the king was an exemption from taxation. This is standard practice in the ancient world. The royal family was exempt, as well as close friends of the king. Freedom from taxes was also used as a boon that a monarch could bestow on a citizen they wanted to show special favor to. Let me prove this. When Goliath came out and challenged the armies of Israel, do you remember what Saul said? Whoever will go out and face Goliath, his family will be exempt from taxes for a year. It was one of the things that was promised to David, to any family. And so David's like, I'll go out there. It'd be a nice benefit for the family. So the idea is this. The temple was God's house. Because Jesus was both God and the Son of the Father, the temple was for him. It was his house. So technically, he shouldn't have to pay the tax. But because he's also a man, he says, of course, Peter, let's pay it. We don't want to offend anybody here. Now, the community purse of the disciples, kept, of course, by Judas Iscariot, certainly had enough coin to pay this tax. But Jesus wanted Peter to be utterly clear on the fact that Jesus was indeed the God to whom the temple stood. And so he tells Pete to do what Peter knew how to do. And you guys tell me, what did Peter know how to do? Fish, right. The fish that he caught would provide for the need. So Peter went fishing, caught a fish with a coin in its mouth, which he took to the tax collector. The lesson here is that following Jesus doesn't exempt us from the normal duties of living in the world. We still have to pay taxes. We have debts to settle. We have business to conduct. God wants us to be faithful in all of our obligations, whether it's to family, friends, work, or even the government. And while we trust God to provide for us, represented by that coin in the fish's mouth, we must also be faithful to work, as Peter had to go fishing to catch that fish. God will work miracles for us as we faithfully follow him. He doesn't dole out miracles on the lazy and the indolent. There's so many ways that we could apply this, but let me just apply this to a select group of people in this room tonight. You who are single. God bless you. No, seriously, I mean that. God bless you. For those of you who are single and who long for a mate, just here's a way to apply this for yourself. Jesus told Peter, Peter, go fishing. You'll catch a fish. There'll be a coin in its mouth. Right? And that'll pay the tax. Miracle. But what did Peter have to do? He had to go fishing. Why didn't Jesus just say, Peter, why don't you just sit there right now and fast and pray and then check your pocket and there'll be a coin in your pocket? Right? He could have, but he didn't. He told Peter to do something. Because there's a lesson in this for us. You singles, be praying for a mate. If you want to be married, be praying for a mate. Be praying for your future mate. But it's probably not best to find that mate by sitting in your house fasting and praying. I mean, it's not like God is going to just suddenly make a pop a mate there, you know, like, oh, look, oh, thank you, Jesus. Listen, what's the key? Be faithful, growing in Christ and serving the Lord, and God will take care of the rest of it. Do what God has called you to do. He's called you to an occupation or a profession. He's called you to be faithful. His profession was to fish. Interesting, isn't it, though? Jesus had called him to catch men. And here he says, hey, go back for a spell here and go do what you know how to do, Pete. So what is it the Lord has called you to do? Be faithful to that. And then trust the Lord in his time to bring you a mate. Verse 1, chapter 18. At that time the disciples came to Jesus saying, who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Luke adds a little color to this story. He says that as they were traveling along, the disciples argued about which among them was the greatest. I just love this. I just love this scene. I love what Gail Irwin says about this. What do we see the disciples doing more than anything else? Just arguing about who's the greatest. Honestly. Whenever we see them, just them talking, their thing is they're arguing about who's the greatest. These great men that we call the apostles. And then Gail says, sometimes I feel so apostolic. The things we get into, man, as we follow Christ, just crazy stuff. Think about the disciples at this point. Jesus has told them that he's going to be betrayed and executed and will rise again on the third day. And they're on their way to Jerusalem now. And as they're going, they're thinking, okay, this is it. This is it. He's going to announce himself as Messiah. This is it. We're reaching a crisis point. He's telling us something's coming. Big is coming. This is it. He's going to out as the Messiah. He's going to take his kingdom. And then he's going to assign roles to us in the kingdom. We're going to administrate his kingdom. And so they're arguing. You know, who's going to get the cushy appointments, the top appointments? Who's going to sit on his left? Who's going to sit on his right? You know, who's going to be the main guys? And they're arguing. You could just, I want to see the video of this. I really do. You know. Verse 2, then Jesus called the little child to him, set him in the midst of them, and said, assuredly, I say to you, unless you are converted, that is changed, and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Man, there is enough in those words to occupy our attention for hours, if not weeks. Gail Irwin draws wonderful insights from this that impacted many people. And tonight, of course, we have to be far more brief. Jesus confronted the disciples' ideas on greatness drawn from the world by saying that it isn't about position, it's about person. The world counts greatness in terms of how much power you have. That power may come by way of physical strength or money or fame, whatever. Jesus set a small child before them and said, you want to know what real greatness looks like? Here it is, this little child. What power does a child have in the world of adults? None. No one's intimidated by a child. In the world of grown-ups, children are powerless and they depend on their parents for everything. Yet everything in the world encourages us towards self-sufficiency and independence. A child is totally dependent on mommy and daddy. Kingdom greatness isn't achieved by personal position and power, but by dependence on God that results in a person repudiating self-sufficiency in favor of Christ's sufficiency. And Jesus says, verse 5, whoever receives one little children like this in my name receives me. This is such an important follow-up to what he's just said. You want to know what greatness is? Look at this. It's a little kid. Powerlessness. That puts you in dependence upon your Father. That's greatness. This is so contrary to the way the world thinks, is it not? For the world, who are the great? Well, it's the people that own their own island. And they have a jet and a helicopter, and they have an endless bank supply, and endless food, and endless health. It's people that have all this power to acquire all this stuff, so they don't need anybody. And Jesus is saying, no, from the kingdom of God's perspective, the greatest of all are those that are utterly dependent on God for their next breath. That's what greatness is, as God accounts it. God's eye looks across the face of the earth today. He does not see greatness in those who are self-sufficient and need no God because they are their own God. His eye is on that little widow who is literally, because of emphysema, looking to him for her next breath. That's greatness, God says. And we have things so upside down. And then as a test of that greatness, whoever receives one little children like this in my name receives me. One of the evidences that we've repudiated the world's ideas of success and greatness is that we don't maneuver to sidle up along those the world esteems as successful and great. Instead, we'll be on the lookout for those who are near and dear to the heart of God, the very ones the world overlooks and despises like little children. Now, it's interesting, and I don't want to judge anyone, and I apologize if it appears that I'm doing that. I'm simply saying this by way of illustration. You'll go to a big meeting where there's a very notable speaker, and you'll see the speaker will give a Bible study or give a speech, and it's moving, it's profound, and there'll be people that want to come up, and they just want to say, man, you really blessed me. Man, thank you so much. That God spoke through you tonight. But there's other people that stand in line to just be near that celebrity. Shake the hand, have the picture taken. We need to be looking for those that everybody else has overlooked. And going to those. And instead of wanting to sidle up next to celebrity, looking for the nobodies. Verse 6. Jesus is going to go into a long section here. We're not going to get through it. We're going to have to wrap this up. A long section on dealing with offenses. The whole issue of offenses. The chapter ends, of course, with that powerful passage on forgiveness that we looked at a couple of weeks ago. But look at this here, verse 6. Whoever causes one of these little ones who believes in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depths of the sea. By these little ones, Jesus means those who have adopted the childlike greatness he's just commended. Friends, it's bad when anyone sins, but when they entice the innocent to sin, they earn a special place in God's wrath and judgment. Jesus said it would be better if they slipped into a pair of cement slippers and jumped off the end of the Wainimi Pier. Verse 7, woe to the world because of offenses, for offenses must come, but woe to that man by whom the offense comes. That word offense means an enticement to evil. The evil may be an outright temptation to sin or an act of abuse that provokes someone to a sinful reaction. Because we live in a fallen world ruled by the devil, it's inevitable that offenses will come. Jesus sets over all of that the pronouncement of doom. He says, woe to the world But there is a special woe on those who make themselves the agent by which offenses come. When Joseph's brothers appeared before him in Egypt, and he finally revealed himself to them, he calmed their fears of retribution by saying that what they'd intended for evil, God had turned to good. Remember that? You guys meant it for evil. God has turned it to good. Now think about it. Think how very wrong it would have been for those brothers to say at that point, oh, hey, cool. Well, we're really glad that we put you in that nasty pit and sold you into slavery. What they did was wrong, though God did turn it to good. As we live in this fallen, sin-filled world, there are times that we're going to suffer for the sins of others. Just as God did for Joseph, he can turn what they do to good. But that in no way excuses those that bring the offense. The end that God miraculously pulls do not justify the means that people sinfully choose. Verse 8, if your hand or foot causes you to sin, and we'll end with this, cut it off and cast it from you. It's better for you to enter into life lame or maimed, rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet, to be cast into everlasting fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. It's better for you to enter into life with 1 eye rather than having 2 eyes and to be cast into hellfire. With some sin, we don't need any external enticements. Our flesh has developed sinful habits that have all the appeal they need in themselves. And through the use of hyperbole, Jesus says that you and I have to be radical in the way that we deal with temptation arising from our flesh. Yeah. Let me hear that a little louder. Yeah. We need to be radical in the way that we deal with temptation. Now, please understand, Jesus never intended anyone to take this literally. He's not saying that you should lop off a hand or gouge out an eye. You can sin as easily with 1 hand as with 2, or 1 eye as with 2. Jesus is saying the desire for holiness must trump all other desires. Any desire that weakens our pursuit of holiness should be summarily excised. Just cut out, just done away with. Don't negotiate, don't argue, don't compromise. Just be done with it. Well, some Christians have decided in applying this, there are certain movie ratings they will not see. They're going to stop at PG-13. There are some Christians that have said, listen, I'll never see an R-rated movie. That's just my decision, they say. Some people have made the decision to cut their TV. They unplug their TV, put it in the closet. Others will cut the cable and only watch DVDs that they agree to watch, that are approved DVDs. Some people have gone through their closet and they've thrown out immodest clothes. Different people will do different commitments in their pursuit of holiness. Now here's the problem. When they take these steps of obedience to the voice of the Spirit, sometimes their Christian friends will say something like, aren't you going a little overboard? Don't be so old-fashioned. Oh, come on. This isn't the Middle Ages. Everybody's doing it. What's the problem? Don't be a prude. Are you being a legalist? It's not legalism if it's a response to the Spirit who speaks to your conscience and sets a guideline for you to follow to help you please the Lord. That's not legalism. It becomes legalism when you start demanding others follow your rule. That's when it becomes legalism. But don't you as a Christian look at a brother or sister for their conviction and say, oh, I don't know, I think you're being a little overboard there. You should be commending them. But again, don't put your rule on somebody else. Take delight in what helps you. Be closer to the heart of God, but don't expect somebody else to live up to that standard. And don't you dare judge them because they don't follow your conviction. That's legalism. But I want to just encourage you right now. If you've been convicted about something and there's a sense that you need to follow something, do it. God bless you. If that helps you respond to the leading of the Spirit, then that's exactly what you need to do. And may I say, if you're not doing it, that would be sin. What Jesus is saying here is we must be radical in our pursuit of holiness, even to the point where we would be willing to cut something out of our lives to please the Lord. But again, he's not saying literally, cut off a hand. I've been having a lot of these big problems. My right hand's just killing me. My left hand's great, but my right hand, I just can't do it. He's saying be radical. Figure of speech and hyperbole.